This lecture will go over the role of sourcing. The objectives of this lecture is to learn to evaluate potential sourcing partners and understand how sourcing decisions will influence a product's price. So what is sourced in the apparel industry? Sizes, size tags, labels, fabric, trim, buttons, labor, packaging, more packaging, tissue paper for packaging. So not only do you have to pay for the boxes, but the shipping and shipping costs, especially if it's overseas or international, which also involves some legal aspects. So today's consumer expects a wide array of apparel products that provide both style and quality at a good value. Developers and retailers need to meet the demands while still remaining profitable. The apparel industry is part of a global production system to use worldwide resources and create value for consumers. When we use the word manufacture, it means to make, but many apparel manufacturers no longer make apparel, they're virtual manufacturers. And virtual manufacturers are brand managers who develop concepts for products. They determine the materials, trims, all of that. They also decide how, when, and where products will be produced and distributed. Sourcing is the practice of procuring materials and production elsewhere. A sourcing mix is a combination of resources utilized for production. Here's an example of the Nicaragua Garment Sourcing Guide. So the column over here on the far left is children's wear, knit shirts, casual pants, jeans, dresses, pajamas, sleepwear. And these are all the different origins of where they can be manufactured, contact and email. So this is an example of a sourcing mix. In the last few years, the percentage of imported apparel that's sold in the United States has increased from 60 to over 95%. So the majority of clothing that is sold in the U.S. is imported. Sourcing options. Sourcing has got to be dynamic. You've got to make a network of sourcing partners to provide balance of capacity, flexibility, value, and efficiency to your company or your brand. All partners must be able to manage continual change in the global environment. And we want to include several types of domestic and offshore sourcing options to meet the changing needs. Sourcing domestically. Domestically owned, you have more control, but it's difficult to stay price competitive. Domestic contracting is when manufacturing facilities are in the same country as the product developer, but they don't necessarily have to be owned by the developer. Advantages of sourcing domestically is that you have a quick response, there's ease of communication, quality inspections are less costly because you don't have to travel across the globe. There's shared paradigms, and there's no risk with quotas. Quick side note, the word paradigm means a set of assumptions, concepts, values, and practices that constitutes a way of viewing reality for the community that shares them. So, for example, living in the U.S., the majority of people share the same assumptions, concepts, and values and day-to-day practices, whereas other countries have their own sets of paradigms, and ours might not necessarily align with theirs, which can make communication and customs difficult. Not customs as in importing, exporting, but customary behaviors. Offshore sourcing. This is the main model that's used for acquiring production capacity. Most nations have apparel production, with many offering unique qualifications like lower costs, expertise, or availability of materials and laborers. The U.S. imports from almost all nations unless the government has restrictions against them. And here's just an example of t-shirt product costs. T-shirt product costs across countries and regions. And over here on the far right is the key for this. So you have the duties, the freight, overhead, and profits, indirect labor, direct labor, and fabric costs. I mean, you can see to produce something in Thailand, looks like the fabric costs are fairly consistent, a little bit higher in Bangladesh, Cambodia, and quite a bit lower in Pakistan. But direct labor cost is going to be higher in Thailand, lower in Vietnam, lower in Bangladesh, higher in China, and higher in China. Looks like indirect labor is also fairly consistent with the exception of Thailand. It's a little bit more expensive. And so the majority of the countries offer lower costs than China. So there's this kind of misconception that, so here's China over here, that China is going to be like one of the cheapest places to manufacture, but Bangladesh, Cambodia, India, Pakistan, and Vietnam actually can produce t-shirts at a lower cost than China. So where are goods sourced? European Union, abbreviated EU, is a very small percentage of the U.S. market. The source of design trends and higher priced goods are usually from the EU, and they also have really nice tailored goods, wool tailored goods. China is still by far one of our largest suppliers, but Vietnam is also quickly gaining market share because they can provide lower production costs than China. So how do we rationalize offshore sourcing? It is cost saving. The apparel industry is incredibly labor intensive, so it requires a lot of manual labor. So we need a lot of workers in low paying locations, and also the ability to source fabrics that are close to the production site will save time and cost. Some of the drawbacks are when you do offshore sourcing, not everyone will understand American design concepts or understand the figure types of the consumers in the U.S. The interpretation of quality standards may be different. There's always going to be the language barrier. And then there's legality issues of importing products to the U.S. Some sourcing alternatives. Domestically owned offshore facilities. So this is where someone from the United States would go purchase a facility in another country, and they would own it. It would just be somewhere else, and they can increase control of the production process and scheduling. There's a lot of initial investment, and you have to understand the political climate. You have to find employees. And if you open a plant in a free trade zone, that will allow for duty-free movement of equipment and supplies, which will help avoid some risks. But there is a big startup risk to do a domestically owned offshore facility. Another sourcing alternative is to do a joint venture, and that's where you have shared ownership of a facility with a business based in another country. This is going to be less risky. You have offshore owners that know the culture and legalities. The capacity is guaranteed. You have more control, and the startup cost is going to be lower and less time, and your local access will be greater because you'll have one person with the manufacturing company, and then you'll be in the United States. Another sourcing alternative is to do licensing, and domestic licensing extends brand value without actually having to produce it. So a lot of major brands can use their name recognition by granting rights to other companies to use their label, but they just have to make sure that the other companies share their same core values or competencies, and then they receive a royalty in return for use of the name or symbol. Some sourcing strategies are determined by a strategic plan and marketing strategy. Prevalence of offshore sourcing is a major stimulus to de-verticalize the United States. Domestic developers are concentrating more on product development, brand building and marketing, and outsourcing production. The main sourcing levels are direct sourcing, cut, make, and trim, full package supplier, and original equipment manufacturing, which is abbreviated OEM, also called package contractors. Direct sourcing is when companies search for their own vendors through personal networking, past experiences with them, internet, and sourcing fairs. Companies that use direct sourcing are Walmart, Sears, Nike, Gap, and the VF Corporation. A sourcing fair is like a fair show. There's an event in Las Vegas called Magic, and it's a trade event where you go and you interact with brands. And let's say you are a Walmart representative, you might go to some of these trade shows and negotiate with some of the sellers of the brand, and or their brand representatives, and you go to a booth and say, hey, I want to buy this many of this item to sell at my store, and then you negotiate and come up with a final price. Cut, make, and trim as a sourcing level is where you can do domestic or offshore contractors for cutting, manufacturing, and finishing garments. The product developer will have to provide the designs, the pattern, the fabrics, control over the creative aspects. And then when someone says CMT, it usually means that they're going to charge for or that will include trim, labor, and overhead. Full package suppliers. This is where you have contractors and trading companies or agents. They source all the materials and they provide all other services: design, pattern making, cutting, making, trimming, quality assurance, packaging, and shipping. The contractor will purchase the fabric, the trim, and the cost of production until the item is shipped. So the developer will file a letter of credit to pay the creditor once the goods are located on the vessel, but until then they won't pay. Original equipment manufacturing is you will have a package contractor, and this helps evenly distribute the responsibility. So the vendor will source and finance the fabric and trim. They will cut, make, trim, finish, package, and deliver to the consumer. And the product developer will provide the design, the spec sheet, and materials to be used. Okay, a couple terminologies here that are used in international trade. A tariff is a tax on imported goods that's assessed by the country of import. And a quota is an annual limit on the volume of a product by category, shipped from exporting country to importing country. Embargo is the prohibition from importing products from specific exporting nations. Countries began negotiating bilateral agreements to set quota levels. So it's between two countries. Evaluating sourcing options. You want to look at the country's political stability, the country's infrastructure, obviously the cost, the quality standards, the production capabilities, how reliable their response time is, what are the channels of communication, and then also the environmental responsibility and some of the working conditions. You want to make sure that they're ethical and safe. Production capabilities. Asia is really well known for their textile innovation, workable minimum yardage, and their excellent sewing skills. China is still currently the largest exporter of apparel in the world. Latin America is beginning to gain more popularity with their close proximity to the United States. They have really quick response time. They've got competitive labor, free trade, but they lack a little bit the sewing skills and the high caliber management. Response time. Timely delivery is key, and responsibility is a two-way street. So the success of Zara and H&M is due to their speed to market strategies, and because they have sourced reliable manufacturers, they have been they've been successful. Working conditions is something that is talked about a lot in international sourcing and manufacturing. Human rights guidelines are a serious consideration, and there's a lot of sensitivity in the U.S. and can bring a lot of, negative press to a company. So a couple organizations that help oversee that are the Worldwide Responsible Apparel Production, the WRAP, and then the International Labor Organization. The channels of communications, you want to make sure that you have clear communication of your standards and specifications, honest and complete quotes, status of lab dips, fabric and garment testing, prototype and product samples. Electronic information sharing has diminished the physical distance and offshore sourcing.